Right, now that we've allowed people to leave and people to join, thank you very much for joining us. Really interesting to be back in this hybrid event. It's lovely to see an audience in front. We were just complaining that we haven't really worn these mics for quite a while and they feel a bit weird. You're normally used to sitting in my living room and not wearing any trousers, but it's a little bit different here. Welcome to the online audience as well. My name is Mark Walker. I'm the Editorial Director at the Fintech Times and the Co-Founder and Chief Operating Officer at the Fintech Power50. The Fintech Power50 is an exclusive fintech accelerator program designed to help scale up fintechs with their domestic and their global growth. And the Fintech Times, as I'm sure you will all know, is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of payments, and I'm very pleased to have with me David Jones, Head of Fintech for Mastercard, UK and Ireland. Perhaps we could start off by giving us a little bit of an introduction of yourself.
Yeah, sure. And just like when you said sitting in the living room wearing no trousers, I had to just literally check, make sure I had trousers on. Yes, so I look after fintechs for Mastercard for the UK and Ireland. So what that means is pretty much all of our established or establishing challenger on neobanks, all of the new programs that we see coming into the network, and all of the enabling layers around that, so the kind of bin sponsors, some work with processors, etc. So the whole thing, encompassing all of it.
And fantastic. So what we're going to have a chat about now is obviously the pandemic. We can't go anywhere without talking about that first of all, I guess. It's triggered some really significant behavioural changes. With adoption of digital payments being sort of the new norm. What we're going to want to look at is how is that consumer demand and the emerging new technologies going to really evolve that further from where it was today. So I don't know, give us maybe a bit of a, not so much of a history of the whole sort of pandemic, but give us a little bit of a flavour.
Yeah, I suspect it's going to be a recurring theme. I heard the chaps before talk about it as well. So obviously, like two obvious things happened through the pandemic. Card not present grew massively, like an acceleration that accelerated for over a number of years into a very short space of time, and also contactless. I think it's 70% of face-to-face transactions are contactless, and actually as well as contactless, digital wallets. So all of these things, so digital wallets and card not present would have grown, but they grew so fast. And there's no going back, right? So the shift from the high street to a remote has happened, and I don't see that returning. I think the high street is going to carve out its own niche in terms of providing services that customers want to have on a face-to-face basis. The move to contactless, there's no going back on that either. What we've actually seen that I think is quite stark, though, and will be lasting, is a change in people's preferences and outlooks. I mean, the pandemic was like a bit of a life-changing event for a lot of people, right? And people see the world a bit different now. And they want products and services, not just payments, that are a little bit more tailored and a little bit more specific. And also, there's been a really big movement towards things that have a purpose. One of the very interesting things we saw really early in the pandemic, we saw a massive increase in cross-border payments from the UK to the US. And we couldn't work out why it was. And it was to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, and people were making donations. And we've seen more and more of this, where people are focused on purposes and think value-driven propositions or value-driven ideas and things that they want to do.
Okay, and that's sort of really interesting that that was sort of a feature of the pandemic where people were thinking more about the well-being of others maybe and more focused on that sort of stuff, and that sort of drove that sort of behaviour. And sort of moving on from that, do you think that behaviour is now staying, and are you seeing that the trend is to continue to do that, or is that falling away slightly?
I think it is. I mean, to a degree, right? I mean, there's some balance. People want financial services and payments that are functional, firstly. But if you can layer on top of that something else. So if you go way back, the competition was for value, right? How much cash back can I get or whatever. You know, we've moved way beyond that, and then the competition became about customer experience, right? So the neobanks came in and they offered just a better customer experience. And that was the competition ground. And it still is. And it's not just that, it's phones, it's everything, right? But now I think that value in the form of kind of human value, like doing something good, it feels like that's here to stay, and we're seeing more and more programs popping up with those kind of value-driven kind of propositions.
Yeah, and it's the sort of the access to digital payments and the ease of sort of wallets and that you think sort of almost fueled that, enabled that to happen.
It's crucial, right? So digital inclusion. People talk about financial inclusion, which is clearly super important, but actually financial inclusion to some extent depends on digital inclusion now. And digital inclusion does more than just financial inclusion because it allows you to access financial services in different ways. You know, the idea that you can't get a loan because you haven't got a credit history. But if you've got a digital history, that can be used kind of almost as a proxy for so there's so many things that are important, and we've got a really laser sharp focus on digital inclusion as an agenda that will lead to then financial inclusion.
Okay, interesting. So sort of talking about that a little bit more, so what's the sort of the mechanisms that you've sort of used to help digital inclusion? What sort of levels of access are you helping people get to?
So, I mean, our role is really as an enabler and as a partner. So we are not pushing out propositions to an end user, either in the kind of merchant space or the consumer space. We're enabling through the power of our network, through the products and services we deploy. But really, we're here to be just a good partner to interesting and exciting new kind of fintechs that want to change the world and want to do cool things and want to make things different. And we kind of like put our shoulder behind that and help them drive that. And we provide some of the infrastructure and we provide some layers to that. So it's very nice. It's symbiotic, right? Yeah. So it works for everybody.
So if we'd sort of dig that into a little bit more, so obviously as an enabler, you're out looking, seeing lots of interesting things happen, and you've obviously mentioned that, you know, the significant of the human impact. How and what type of new partnerships have you sort of brought on board to sort of encourage that and support it?
So we, funny enough, I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago. And there were three of our partners on there, so Algebra, Sifted, and Unizest, who all have different propositions in the inclusion space, right? So it's all about bringing different financial services that meet different needs, right? People have specific needs. People aren't just one homogenous kind of group of that all have the same, you know, the same wants and needs and so on. So it's about creating propositions that meet a specific need. It doesn't have to be inclusion. There are other propositions that we've been working with customers in the kind of sustainability space as well, which is obviously very, very important to a lot of people. I think we'll see more and more and more niche propositions that serve a particular market. I think it's going to be harder to serve the mass market. I think the mass market is probably quite well served. So the focus has to be on whose needs aren't met. And then how do we grow that? And how do we find adjacent spaces where the proposition that works for this type of person maybe works for that type of person too? And that's another thing that we're helping them with.
Yeah, so as you sort of mentioned earlier, it's more about the sort of the tailor-made payment solutions and more about the actual fact of people being able to choose how they do that through the various different fintechs that are sort of coming up and developing those sort of niche tailored areas.
I think one of the themes, actually, maybe I sort of alluded to it, but I didn't really say it specific. This idea of hyper-personalization, I think, becomes quite important, particularly in younger consumers. The idea, because they've grown up, and everything they see on their phone is effectively tailored for them, right? Even if they don't really want it to be, right? So the idea of taking some generic off-shelf proposition, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't appeal. And so this hyper-personalized way of offering people products and services that fit with their needs and their outlook. Now, it's a bit of an art as well as a science, right? Because you can't hyper-personalize just to one individual. You've got to find a way of making something that has broad enough appeal that you can scale, but still feels specific and still feels directed at a person. And you know, this is the space where it's happening, actually. The fintech, particularly in the UK, it's just super exciting. We're seeing a lot of this type of kind of new entrant, new proposition coming to market.
And I'm quite interested, obviously, from Mastercard's point of view, what kind of do you see your role in this sort of the evolution process? As you said, enabler, but what sort of onus do you think is on yourself to make sure that it's not only available, but also done in the appropriate way?
So payments, beyond everything else, payments, number one, they need to work. Number 2, they need to be simple. Number 3, they need to be secure. Number 4, they need to be fast, right? So these fundamentals, and that's what we deliver, right? So you can have an idea that meets a particular need or speaks to a particular segment, but it needs to be delivered in a way that works. Now, you can build the app and you can have that really, really cool kind of user experience and all of it, but without what we do as the underlying infrastructure, the payment will be a letdown. I heard the guys earlier talking about, different ways of payment, all of that. And that's fun, and I think it's true that there's going to be an explosion of different ways to pay, and we are fully there for that, right? We fully embrace it. In all of it, though, you need to have some rules that govern who's liable for what when things go wrong. You need to have a kind of common and consistent user experience. If I do this, this will happen. It needs to be fast, it needs to be secure, and so on and so on. And that's what we provide.
And I think, obviously, it would be remiss for us not to talk about some of the sort of the key trends like open banking and making payments in that respect. Maybe not for now, because digital currencies 360 is happening in the other room, so we don't really want to go in too much in digital currencies. But how's Mastercard working with both those sort of two new areas? So
open banking is exciting. It's taking some time to build momentum. I think we've seen more activity in the kind of AISP space than the PISP space, right? Which maybe feels like that's what you would expect. In the actual payment space, we see more in the I'm paying myself type proposition. So whether it's funding a wallet or funding a transaction or bill pay, for example, so we're seeing it happen, and we've invested in this space, right? So we're excited about it. I think it will still be a little while before we see it being used at scale in retail payments, consumer to merchant. I think that will take time. I think it needs to prove to the consumers and to the retailers that it's somehow better. I think they were talking about that before, but I'm reframing it maybe slightly. Prove that you're better. Prove that you're either faster or better value or somehow better, and people will use it. But first, you've got to prove it's better. And it might not just be open banking. There are other kind of account-to-account kind of based payments as well. So we are, we kind of back all the horses, if you like. So we are excited about all of that. In terms of digital currencies, I'm not going to talk about that a lot now. I'm far from an expert, right? Other people will. I think the one thing I'd say is a lot of the excitement so far, a lot of what's happened so far is really just people trading digital currencies, and the fact that they're digital currencies sort of doesn't matter almost, because it could be almost anything they're trading. Using blockchain type solutions to actually affect payments it's on the horizon. It's more, I think, a B2B kind of space at the moment. I think over time, again, a bit like open banking, is there a reason why I would choose to affect a payment to a retailer this way instead of that way? Because if you don't give me a reason to do it, I won't do it, because what I've already got kind of works. Maybe we'll see those reasons, and I think there'll be specific areas. So, art, for example, or which is getting a lot of press right now. But so there will be specific areas, but it's not going to be in 10 minutes' time.
And so your role as Mastercard is obviously to keep an eye on these things, as you say, open banking, investing heavily in it, keeping an eye on what the future is. So you obviously see them as trends that are going to continue.
Yep.
Are there other areas that you've also got your eye on and sort of the next evolution of payments and what you think might be moving forwards?
Yeah, do you know what? I think we talked about it a little bit. I think the thing that we're obsessed about is choice. So consumer choice, actually not just consumer choice, but also merchant choice, retailer choice, right? Choice. In that moment that I want to make a payment, how do I want to make that payment? And let's make it possible for people to make a payment in the way they want to. So I think choice is really, really key, and something we're obsessed about, and which is why we invest in lots of different areas. I think clearly different ways of making payments, so open banking, digital, they're clearly going to have a big impact, but maybe not in the way we see. I think the most difficult final step for them to reach is where the real scale is, which is I'm a consumer, I'm buying something from you as a retailer. There are adjacent payment spaces, B2B particularly, which I think is probably more naturally open to different types of innovative payments. I think it'll be a little while before we see fundamental change in retail payments. I mean, maybe the first thing we might see in the next couple of years is just that process of actually, you know, typing a 16-digit card number is going to start going away. There's going to be different ways of doing that, which I think will be welcome to everybody, right? Nobody wants to do that anymore. Functionally, it works. It's not the best experience, so it will change. Other than that, I think it'll take some time. Maybe there'll be another world-changing event that accelerates it, right? I mean,
hopefully we'll have a couple of years off before that, with any luck. But
exactly.
Okay, and I think we're going to be able to open the floor up for a few questions as well in a moment. So I was just going to sort of summarise, really. I think what we've kind of boiled a lot of this evolution down to is the move to hyper-personalisation and the ability for consumers to make the choice how, where, and when to pay. Are there any questions that we can take from the audience or from the online? Nothing at all.
No questions?
No questions? I have a question in backup anyway, so. No, I'll go for my question then. I'll take the floor. So we touched on a little bit of Mastercard's responsibility for supporting the industry. How does that tie in with regulation? Because obviously lots of things are going through regulation at the moment. You know, you can't avoid the buy now, pay later discussions that are going on. Where is Mastercard with regulators, and how do you work together to protect consumers and make sure the industry is moving in the right direction?
So regulation is really important. Protecting consumers is key, and actually also protecting merchants to some extent as well. But regulation is super important. I think what we've seen in buy now, pay later is it's like an explosion, right? And eventually it feels quite likely that there'll be some regulation that kind of calms that down a little bit. And I'm not sure that every lending decision that's made in those moments is necessarily a great lending decision. I'm not going to sort of say any more about that. We work quite closely with regulators. A really good example, SCA, right? So we worked so closely with the FCA, also with UK Finance and the whole industry, in fact, for maybe 3 or 4 years in that process. And when I compare that to the approach at Europe, actually the FCA was super engaged, and in the end, they took a lot of criticism for the delays that happened, but in the end, we delivered a good outcome, i.e. fraud steadily reduced, and there hasn't been some big bang where people can't make transactions anymore. So that's an example of regulation working well, I think, and us working with the regulator.
Absolutely. No, that's very good. Yes.
Hi, David. Alexander Modley from Flybits. Just asking, you know, with this view you have of the landscape of fintech and talking about hyper-personalization, which I agree is critical, can you give us some best examples, best in class, of financial institutions actually doing hyper-personalization?
I mean, it's tricky for me to just name check some of my customers. I have a lot of customers. I think we're seeing, what Curve did, I think, was really interesting and very different. I think what Monzo are doing is very interesting. Revolut too. I think we're seeing Algebra is super interesting, where it's the proposition's based around kind of Islamic faith-based principles, but actually it's open to all, which is quite an interesting idea. I think Sibstar, maybe, the one I mentioned previously, which is hyper-personalized. It's a proposition about people with dementia that can't necessarily manage their own finances properly and need help from someone who's got power of attorney, but still need to be able to access finances to be able to buy stuff. That's a very, I think, specific example of something that's quite narrow at one level, but actually is broadly applicable in a number of circumstances. So, I mean, I think most of my customers are very cool and do cool different things. Sorry, I'm sitting on the fence a little bit here. But yeah, I think Sibstar is a really good example of a very, very specific, very niche focus on a specific need. So.
Okay. I think that draws us to a conclusion. Thank you very much for your time, David. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
And thank you, Mark. Really enjoyed that conversation. Much appreciated.